I don't know who of you is a follower of true crime programs or any kind of court programs and the likes. If you are, do you sometimes wonder what makes people evil? Why do people become criminals? Or what makes someone develop a criminal mind? Before I continue with the episode, I might issue a trigger warning here. If you are a victim of crime, a victim of violence, a person who might get triggered into flashbacks or any kind of post-traumatic stress symptoms, you might not want to listen to the episode or listen with caution, because I will be talking about criminal minds, what influences people to become criminals. You may notice that I'll keep things to a more basic level and without much jargon. I'm trying to avoid jargon just to offer a basic understanding, because I'm not a trained forensic criminal psychologist. I'm not in law enforcement and I'm not in the court system either. And the episode is in absolutely no way about excusing crime or dismissing any harm that it causes, because the harm and the effect crimes have on people, and that includes all the people working in law enforcement and the court system as well, is absolutely immense. Even just from one single crime, it can be absolutely immense. So the purpose of this episode is about understanding, because when we understand why people behave in certain ways, especially in destructive ways, we may become better equipped to prevent, to intervene, or to rehabilitate. Plus, we may be better equipped to reflect on own thoughts, own beliefs, and our responses. So I'll start with the question, what shapes the criminal mind? And the first bit to look at is the age-old debate of nature versus nurture, asking, is criminal behavior innate, as in, are people born to be criminals, or is it learned? The answer to all that is that it's very rarely one or the other. So it's usually a combination of inborn things as well as the nurture side, the learned behaviors. Looking at biological and neurological factors, some studies have found differences in the prefrontal cortex of habitual offenders. And let's remember the prefrontal cortex, that's the area that governs judgment, impulse control, and moral reasoning. There could be issues in the amygdala, or with the amygdala, our emotional alarm system that I keep calling the internal warning system. That may function differently in people with high aggression or low empathy. There could be issues with the neurochemicals like serotonin and dopamine, the famous neurotransmitters. Let's remember that they are linked to mood and reward, and issues with those can influence risk-taking and aggressive levels. And there could be genetic predispositions that can increase susceptibility to impulsivity or poor emotional regulation, but those usually don't cause criminality on their own. Next part would be the look at the nurture side of it, like the environment, any kind of trauma, and the social learning. Childhood neglect, abuse, or chronic instability can lay some groundwork for maladaptive coping strategies. Growing up in violent households or impoverished communities can normalize crime as survival. There could be attachment disruption in families or with parents when children are not feeling safe, they are not feeling loved or not seen. Those attachment disruptions can weaken moral development and trust in others. It's important to remember that early experiences shape neural pathways, and the brain wired for survival and connection often misreads threat and reacts with fight or flight, and sometimes with fatal consequences. Examples for the nature-nurture section may be that family members may have committed crimes or may have done any kind of illegal activities, even just like taking drugs. And as a young person, they might be just kind of doing the same because that's what they do in the family. Maybe they've got people like that in their circles that do drugs or commit kind of crimes of opportunity, as in stealing things, and that not just for survival, but for the thrill of it. That's very often with adolescents, that do things for the thrill of it. Or sometimes there could be family history from a past generation that they had already problems with authority, that they don't accept authority, that they challenge authority. So as a child, they might pick it up and then in later life challenge authority in a similar way, even though they did commit crimes. Next, let's look at some emotional and psychological drivers. Many people who engage in criminal activity don't really fit the stereotype of the evil villain. Instead, they show signs of emotional detachment, low empathy, or distorted thinking. Looking at unresolved trauma and emotional pain, many criminal histories begin with personal pain, grief, loss, or abandonment. And without tools to process or regulate emotion, this pain may be externalized as violence, manipulation, or control-seeking behaviors. Looking at personality disorders and cognitive traits next. Conditions such as antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy involve persistent disregard for others' rights. These individuals may lack guilt, remorse, or emotional depth. But even those without a diagnosis may show traits like impulsivity, low self-awareness, or poor frustration tolerance. These are often learned responses to early unmet needs. I added a section on narcissistic traits in here as well, because they sometimes can play quite a big role in some crimes too. While not all people with narcissistic tendencies are criminals, narcissism can be a significant contributing factor, particularly in crimes involving manipulation, fraud, coercive control, or violence driven by ego injury. What are narcissistic traits? An inflated sense of self-importance, a need for admiration or power or constant attention seeking, lack of empathy for others, or a tendency to exploit or devalue people to meet one's own needs. In some individuals, especially those with narcissistic personality disorder, those traits can combine with other factors like impulsivity, entitlement, or poor emotional regulation to justify harmful or illegal behavior. For example, a narcissistic individual might commit white-collar crimes out of belief they are above the rules, above the law, or because they deserve it. They use charm or status to manipulate victims in romantic or financial scams, or they react with rage or revenge if their ego is wounded. Because their internal sense of self is often fragile, criticism or blame can feel intolerable, leading to disproportional or aggressive responses. When coupled with poor impulse control or a lack of conscience, this can lead to manipulative, vindictive, or even violent behavior. Understanding narcissism in this context does not excuse the harm caused, but it helps us recognize certain patterns, particularly in crimes driven by ego, image, or control. Examples for emotional and psychological drivers could be this sense of entitlement. I deserve this. This is for me. The others don't deserve that. Or it is looking for notoriety. Now, I've watched a lot of programs on Ted Bundy already, but I'm still not sure. Was he looking for notoriety? Was it narcissism? Was it a mix? Was there family issues as well? In his case, it kind of seemed to have built up from a younger age up to the notoriety he achieved before he got on the electric chair. Or you have when two people come together, they want to be together like a couple, but they both have spouses and families. So they then derive plans to get rid of their spouses, to kill them, so they themselves could go and get together and live their dream life, which, however, might not be such a dream life if it all comes out into the open, what they did, and they end up with lifelong jail sentences. There's very often entitlement involved, any kind of psychological disorders. Is there a delusional disorder, actually? Anyway, I come back to delusion later, for a later example too. The next area we're looking at is the era of social and cultural influences. Because let's not underestimate the power of our environment, of the environment of people, be it social or general. Poverty and inequality, which are rampant in some areas of chronic deprivation. People may engage in crime, not out of greed, but out of deprivation or a lack of opportunity, and sometimes some survival is involved as well. When basic needs are not met, survival instincts often override moral considerations. Then there's the area of belonging and identity. So especially in deprived areas, and sometimes in other areas as well, gangs and criminal groups often fill a social vacuum, offering status, purpose, or protection. We humans are wired for connection, and if someone feels excluded from mainstream society, they may bond or involve themselves with alternative systems, whether or not they are legal. And linked to this context are normalized violence and cultural messages. When violence is witnessed or accepted as normal from a young age, the brain adapts. And injustice, systematic bias, or lack of trust of authority can also breed resentments and rebellion. Examples for social and cultural influences could be something similar to what I already mentioned with peers at school, like younger people that kind of do little crimes of opportunity, things like that, or they're taking drugs. Or another thing in the section would be about gangs, which often can be found in more impoverished or deprived areas of cities. But not necessarily. If we look at gangs or families, criminal families like the mafia, they're a bit more upmarket, but there's still a bit like gang mentality though. Sometimes with those, you have to commit some crimes to get into the gang or into the structure of this, whatever criminal organization it is. But then we've also got examples of when people from different cultures come into another country and they bring their culture, their mindset, their way of thinking into their new country and then treat the people from the new country the same way how they would do it in their own country. And that's not necessarily the way that things should be done. This is something that hampers integration greatly, and it can cause massive community tension. Next, let's look at a bigger area again, which is the area of beliefs, mindset, and criminal thinking patterns. At the heart of criminal behavior often lies a set of distorted beliefs or cognitive patterns of thinking. Some of the criminal minds might think of, I deserve this more than they do. The world's unfair, so I'm just evening out the score. Or they would do it to me if they could. And if I don't take it, someone else will. So these mentioned ways of thinking are not just excuses. For those criminal minds, they're often deeply held belief systems shaped by life experiences. Cognitive distortions like blaming, minimizing harm, or rationalizing injustice are common in repeat offenders, and they can be addressed through cognitive behavioral therapy or mindset-based work. I'm always a bit cautious about rehabilitation because, yes, there are cases where it works, but there are a lot of cases where the people fall back into crime after they get released. Sometimes the criminal mind isn't just about survival or emotional detachment. It's driven by ideology or extreme belief systems. So extreme beliefs and justifications for harm, they may be religious, political, racial, or even personal philosophies that become all-consuming and rigid. And examples for these would be, this group deserves punishment, or I am chosen to carry out justice, or the world is corrupted, I must destroy what's wrong. Beliefs like this can lead to radicalization, vigilante violence, or even acts of terrorism or murder. What's common here is a dehumanization of others. Once someone no longer sees others as people, but as threats, enemies, or obstacles, it becomes far easier to justify harm. The psychological process often builds slowly, and it comes from a growing sense of personal injustice or grievance. It can be from echo chambers that reinforce black and white thinking, or a belief of moral superiority or entitlement to act. And again, many of these beliefs form over time, shaped by social environments, trauma, and identity needs. This is where early intervention, emotional education, and promoting cognitive flexibility, i.e. the ability to hold multiple perspectives, can make all the difference. That has to be on the level of the education system, however, and not just like through later rehabilitation. That has to start early, especially the teachings that you have to find different perspectives for one story, for one headline. And I keep banging on about that in episodes now because I found that so important. I think this is one of my big life lessons, that it's important to look at different angles of a story because there is never just one single angle. This story that we get presented with, there's always more to it. Examples here for beliefs, mindset, and criminal thinking patterns that could very often apply to cults, to religions, to groupings of people. Maybe groupings of people who hate others because they are different, look different, behave different. And with regards to religions, it could happen that there are offshoots from some sort of mainstream type religions, and they then develop some really strange beliefs that have actually nothing to do with the original religion they are deriving off. It's when some people are coming along and they think they are a prophet, they're a goddess, they are a very special being that receives messages from God or from Jesus or from Satan or any kind of other celestial or imaginative being. Those people then find followers. They go out to find followers. They spread their messages and find followers. They indoctrinate people. They convince people of their special abilities. They create delusions. They create massive delusions. And some delusions may be that they declare some people as dark, as zombies, and it is actually their belief that to murder those people, to murder those dark people, those zombie-labeled people, is doing those dark people a favor if they get taken out of this life and moved on to another life. We had this kind of thinking in the Daybell case in the US, but that was a case that had a lot of other things in there. There was narcissism. There was some generational strange behavior in the family. There was problems with authority in the family of one of the people. I'm not going any further into that. If you want to find out more about the Daybell case and all the ins and outs of that, there are a lot of different YouTube podcasts or podcasts on other providers as well on the subject, or true crime podcasts, or family members have started podcasts as process of their healing. It was a massive case, and the last court cases have only just finished. So if you're interested in that case, just find out more from YouTube and these other podcasts. It was a massive case and a very disturbing one as well. And we look at the question next, and finally, can the criminal mind be changed? In some cases it can't, in some cases it can. And importance to remember here is that neuroplasticity is happening in the brain, which means the brain and the structure of thinking and beliefs can be changed because the brain can rewire itself. Therapeutic approaches that address trauma, improve emotional regulation, and build empathy have been shown to reduce recidivism. I've learned this new word today, which means the tendency of a criminal to re-offend. I didn't have to do the fancy words. There are restorative justice programs where offenders make amends and understand the human impact of their actions. That can spark transformation, and developing self-awareness, purpose, and a growth mindset can be key to rehabilitation. But change requires the right conditions: support, accountability, education, and often someone believing that change is possible. And that belief shouldn't just come from someone else, maybe linked to the person in question, but from the person itself. Because if a person does not see a problem with what they have done, if they cannot see themselves changing, then it will not work. Measures to help them change their mindset or change towards a more healthier way of thinking that does not include any criminal thoughts or beliefs, that would not work if the person doesn't see a problem with what they have done. And this brings us to the end of this episode of Exploring Brain and Mind. As always, I'd appreciate lots if you download the episode, if you like and share the episode with others, and if you subscribe and follow the podcast. Thank you for listening, and I hope you will listen to some future episodes again.